Well, g'day, Chris. It's great to speak to my favourite Yorkshireman living in Melbourne. Good to
Lovely
talk
to
to you.
be here, Mike. Lovely to speak to you again.
And we want to talk about your pretty excellent book, Biblical Critical Theory, which is making a bit of a splash. I knew it was making a splash when I saw it at a conference one year, and the first printing had sold out before the book was released. So you had clearly hit a nerve, or you were scratching where a lot of people were itching. And my understanding of the book is you're attempting to do a little bit like Augustine did in his own critique of pagan culture, is look at various areas to which the Bible speaks, and then point out how our contemporary world, whether that's pagan, modern, or postmodern, has its own ideas on this that doesn't really address the issues that the Bible talks about. And the Bible often offers much better solutions to some of the things our contemporary world is interested in, ranging from how to be a human being, what is justice, the nature of evil, those sorts of things. Would that be a fair summation of the book, Chris?
Yeah, well, that's certainly what I'm trying to do, Mike. Augustine is very much the pattern. He's the blazing sun to which I'm trying to hold a flickering candle. And what he does in the City of God in particular to late Roman culture is, I just think, so paradigmatic for what Christians can do today in relating to our own late modern culture, or whatever you want to call it. Because the brilliance, I think, of the City of God is that he takes the whole of the Bible story and arranges over the whole of late Roman culture, reading it through the whole Bible story. And that just gives him such a powerful and nuanced way of engaging with Rome. And to use a phrase of John Milbank's, he ends up out narrating Rome in the sense that he tells Rome's story more convincingly and in a richer way than Rome can tell its own story. And that's, in a sense, the high watermark that I'm fumblingly trying to reach in the book. Yeah.
So you're trying to out-narrate modernist and postmodernist accounts of what it means to be a human by using the Bible as a resource that speaks to the human condition, what it means to be a human being, and also answers the deep and transcendental questions of human existence.
Yeah. On the basis that the biblical story provides a richer and more nuanced and more truer to life version of what a human being is than the different stories circulating in our society,
Yeah.
largely because it can account convincingly for both the best that we're capable of and the worst. So altruistic acts, that don't benefit my people group, that don't benefit my genetic heritage, people giving their lives for others who they don't know, is celebrated, by the Christian, but it doesn't sort of rock her world in the sense that, yes, that is what people made in the image of God can do. But also, the torture of children, or whatever the worst example that we could possibly think of as, the most depraved, wretched human behavior is. The Christian will weep over that. Yeah. But it won't rock her world in the sense that, yes, the Bible makes it very clear that people who've turned away from God are very capable of gratuitous evil, not just instrumental evil, but evil for its own sake. And it's rare that an account of the human being today is able to spread itself over that full keyboard, if you like, of human behavior equally. Usually they're much better at explaining the wretchedness of humanity, the evil stuff that we can do, looking at you, Thomas Hobbes, or the really great things that we're capable of doing. And that would be a more sort of Jean-Jacques Rousseau type of vibe.
Or Steven Pinker today. Yeah.
Yeah, or Steven Pinker today. But the Bible, because it's a story, and because that story has different moments, that because creation is different to fall, and being made in the image of God is not completely erased by turning away from God, is able to, I think, provide a subtler account of human beings, and one that's healthier, because we don't have to explain away any part of who we are. We don't have to say altruism is basically just disguised self-interest, or we don't have to say evil is only a function of social conditions and nobody ever wants to be really, really nasty. which some of these other positions end up having to do, because they can't allow themselves to think either that, no, human beings can just be really, really awful, or human beings can just be really, really nice. But the Christian doesn't need to explain any of that away.
Yeah, that doesn't mess. There's no system that needs to be messed with or tinkered. But I know one thing that has excited interest and perplexion about the book is the title, the critical theory side, because as I'm sure you are aware, things like critical race theory are a big thing in the US, and there's the whole area of critical theory. I do know some people who were expecting you to take a side for and against things like critical race theory, and they're a little bit perplexed, but nonetheless edified when they find out the book is not really about that kind of a thing. It's more like this thing, critique of the world around us and offering a better narrative about the various loci that you cover. So what do you mean by biblical critical theory?
I'm trying to recapture with that term the broader tradition of critical theory that's actually, I think, inaugurated with Augustine's City of God. So there's this Augustine scholar, Charles Matthews, in the US. And one argument that he makes that really struck me was that the City of God is the first example that you get in the Western tradition of someone taking a position outside a dominant culture and trying to explain the whole of it and critique the whole of it. So there've been little bits of cultural critique, and people have, said this, that, and the other in society is not that good. But Augustine is taking a systematic stance that is not complicit with the hegemonic ideology of Rome. In other words, he's looking at it through a biblical lens, and he's critiquing the whole thing. And to the extent that that is true, and I'm persuaded that there's a really good case for that being true, the origin of what we now call critical theory in our tradition is actually Christian. Like, just as a historical matter of fact, it just happens to be Christian. I think there's also another argument, a stronger argument to make, that it's sort of, and this might sound weird, but bear me out, it sort of has to be Christian, in the sense that what the biblical story provides you with is a place to stand, so to speak, outside the status quo, from which to judge the status quo. So you're allowed to say, from a Christian position, this particular thing in society is unjust. Not just that I think it's unjust or I have a feeling that it's unjust, but it is objectively unjust, because there's a vision of a better society that is given to me in the biblical story. I read the end of Revelation, I read the first two chapters of Genesis. I see what it should look like when it's working well. So I've got something to measure the status quo against. But if I don't have a story like the Bible's, where you have these fundamental ruptures in history, say between creation and fall, or between these last days and the final consummation, I don't have anything to measure the status quo against. I've just got what there is. And I can choose one bit of what there is to measure the rest of what there is by, but there's no particular reason for choosing this bit of what there is as the measure. And so you need, in order to do critical theory in a way that almost everyone who does it does, which is to say, no, there are some things that are just unjust in society. And they're not unjust because I think they're unjust or I feel they're unjust. They are unjust for everybody. And if you don't recognize it, that there's a problem with that. In order to be able to say that, I need this place to stand that's not part of the status quo. And there's a recognition of this in secular critical theorists. So Nietzsche is very live to this. When he says in the Happy Science at one point, that we've taken our flame, we secular people, from Christianity, and that's the reason that we can make the sort of moves that we're making, he says. And there's a really interesting point at the end of a book called Minima Moralia by Theodor Adorno, is one of the Frankfurt School critical theorists, these sort of cultural Marxists, as they're sometimes called. And he says that, look, what we really need in order to be able to do critique thoroughly and well is, and he uses this theological language, he says, a standpoint of redemption. Now, he's not saying we should all become Christians. Like, he's no He holds no brief for Christianity, and he's not suggesting that he's opening himself up to theology, but it's nevertheless interesting that he reaches for that theological language to describe where we need to stand in order to be able to critique society in a way that's saying something more than I have bad feelings about this aspect of the way that we live. And so I think critical theory, to the extent that it says things in society are just plain unjust for everybody, needs something like this standpoint of redemption. And Christianity provides a robust and rigorous one. And critical theorists bend over backwards and twist themselves in knots often to try and get one without reference to God or to anything outside the created order. And it's really hard.
Yeah.
Like, they try very hard, and it's really difficult to get this sort of standpoint of redemption. And people like Derrida, in his later writing, are tortuously seeking this, because nobody wants to say whatever happens in society is just fine. Like, nobody who grew up in the 1960s, like a lot of these mid-20th century French theorists do, want to say, the Holocaust was just a thing and there are other things, and like some people thought it was good, some people thought it was bad. Nobody can sit comfortably with that. So you have to have some measure of justice and injustice, and it's just really hard to get one if you don't have something like Christianity giving you this standpoint of redemption. So that's my approach to critical theory. I think historically it happens to have been Christian in its inception. And it's also logically very hard to see how you can do it rigorously without Christianity. And then you come to the current sort of heat in the media around critical race theory and these sort of narrower definitions of critical theory. And you can make sense of them better because you've got this broader story that they fit into. But if all you ever think about is what's happened in the last 10 years, it's really hard to make sense of what these critical theories are trying to do, where they came from, the moves that they're making. They just seem alien. And so what I'm trying to do is tell this bigger story that makes sense of those.
Yep. That's right. I think there's a lot of aversion to critical theory because of the way it's used and the culture wars backdrop, where it has a wider sort of background in contemporary philosophy. There's certainly post World War II philosophy. And people should know that your primary expertise is not just Augustine; it's also modern philosophy, particularly French philosophers like Derrida and the like. I've been reading a little bit on critical theory just to prepare myself to deal with some of these complex terms and going on. So I've been reading a little bit old now, Paul Lakeland's book Theology and Critical Theory, which isn't a bad book. He's more interested in the application of critical theory to the Christian social tradition. But there was one thing he did say that I thought was interesting. Critical theory is not interested in intellectual history, but in the emancipation of the present for the sake of the future. Which would indicate it does have a kind of a liberative, it does sort of have like a liberative streak, which I think you could say is biblical, but it's also got the idea, what do you want to call it, progress, or even an eschatology. Or dare I say, like building the kingdom of God. How do you create a just and lasting society that's fair, equitable, and just? And these are things which I think are hard to imagine unless you've got some sort of Christian heritage flowing through. These questions are not natural. I mean, Plato can talk about what is good, what is right, what is noble, what's the ideal republic, and even with a theory of justice, he's still not really concerned with from my reading, from the what's just for the slave and what's just for the master. There is a little bit of a self-serving thing in it, but when it comes to critical theory as well, one piece of literature that I think may even precede Augustine in critical theory is the Book of Revelation. Now, as you know, Chris, the Book of Revelation is often sold as a bit of apocalyptic soap opera. But the Book of Revelation really is unique by being one piece of literature in antiquity that's not written by elites, that shows what the Roman Empire looks like from the perspective of those who have the empire's boot on their throat. So, I mean, maybe Augustine was, riffing off a bit of Revelation, because you do get a critique of pagan power, or, Roman economics of exploitation, idolatry, injustice, its demand for worship. It believes it is the only arbiter of divine truth, that it operates with divine sponsorship and the like. Do you see that the Book of Revelation as doing a bit of, biblical critical theory?
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Mike. Yes, absolutely, and emphatically. Yes, that is what it's doing. And you're absolutely right as well to reference that in relation to Augustine. So you can read the City of God as a commentary on the Book of Revelation, or as an expansion of what the Book of Revelation is already doing. I mean, you've got the two cities there in Revelation. You've got Babylon and the New Jerusalem. That's the structure in terms of which its critique of ideology is set forth. And so to say that Augustine is the first instance of this critique of a whole culture, I guess you need to add outside the Bible, because in a very concentrated, short form, that is precisely what the Book of Revelation is doing. And as you say, it's really fascinating, partly because it's not written by the winners in that particular historical moment. It's not written by Rome. It is, to use the language of modern critical theory, it's a subaltern narrative. It's the narrative of the oppressed. People were being killed for being Christians in this period. And the way, and I hope we'll be able to talk a little bit about this because the details are fascinating, the way that it critiques Babylon, this city, this earthly city, and the way in which it lifts the lid on what Babylon is really like, I think just has so much to teach us today in the way that we engage with the late modern culture around us. And it's a tragedy, isn't it, that we often miss that, because all the oxygen is sucked away by these interminable debates about precisely what happens when in the chronology of Revelation. And we sort of almost shy away from the book because we don't want to get bogged down in those debates.
Yeah.
But we close ourselves off, therefore, to this immense treasury of patterns of cultural critique that I think we desperately need to appropriate and make use of today.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's so much in Revelation that comes up that people don't mention. The critique of the economics of Babylon is one. So don't do business with it, don't trade with it, because everything is tainted with oppression, corruption, injustice, idolatry. The way it treats the different peoples, the way it's worshipped by the world, the worship of this particular all-powerful state, which, I mean, that's something that people on left and right sides should normally or naturally be allergic from. Yeah, but it's if you think of it, the book as largely a critique of Roman power, using the genre, the repertoire of Jewish apocalyptic literature, it remains powerful, and also adds elements of hope, and there's Christology, and there's advice to the church. It's very practical and pragmatic and all that. But yeah, the idea that this is a critique of the Roman Empire,
and I think as well, Mike, it's a massive critique of us as well, and I include Christians in the us too, of the contemporary way in which we do things. So just to pick up on one thing that you were mentioning there, the critique of the way that Babylon uses economic exploitation to subdue its vassal states. It's so fascinating, and this was made clear to me by a wonderful book on Revelation by Richard Borkham, The Theology of the Book of Revelation. And he points out, isn't it interesting that economic exploitation is embodied in the Book of Revelation in the figure of a prostitute? Because he says we today divide two things. We divide financial promiscuity from sexual promiscuity. And so in our culture, speaking schematically, you've got those broadly on the right who say we should be controlled and responsible for what we do with our bodies, but don't tell me what to do with my money. Don't take my money off me. That's mine. And we've got people broadly on the left who say we should be responsible and controlled with what we do with our money. We should redistribute it in society. We should help the poor. That we should make sure that money is spread around in society. But don't tell me what to do with my body. That's mine. And he makes the point that by showing both of these together, using sexual promiscuity as an image of financial promiscuity, he's in a sense lifting the lid on the partialness or the selectiveness of our own morality. Either just focusing on being responsible with money or just focusing on being responsible with our bodies in a way that the Bible doesn't divide. So, in the lists of sins in the New Testament, you've got greed alongside sexual immorality. And, you're skewering, so to speak, the right and the left today. They're both partial. They're both taking and ripping apart this biblical vision of what it means to be workers for the common good and for the shalom, the peace and prosperity of the city. And so, yes, Revelation is critiquing Rome, but by goodness, it's also shining a light on us and our own society and the illegitimate divisions and distinctions that we make as well.
Yeah, I think that's worth bearing. I mean, that's certainly, I think, a good way of thinking of Revelation today, rather than sort of, well, what chapter are we living in this week? We've got, COVID, we've got war in the Middle East. What's the chapter? It's more enduring that way, because it allows us also to deploy the same biblical critical reasoning to our churches, which I think it does in the early chapters, to the empire, and then to refocus our hope on what it means to hold to the testimony of Jesus, which is a line out of the book. What does it mean in this sort of world of ascending autocracies and predatory economics? What does it mean to hold to the testimony of Jesus, and then to refocus on our hope on the ultimate city of God, is the ultimate expression of God's goodness, love, hope, and justice. So
just to fold back on something that you said there that I think is incredibly important and quite distinctive in terms of cultural critique today, and something I think that as Christians we really need to take on board, and that can be, I think, to some extent a distinctive of the way that Christians do cultural critique, is when you mentioned that the church gets both barrels in the early chapters of Revelation. So it's not just looking out at Rome and saying, oh, how corrupt and terrible Rome is. And, I wish everyone could be like us in the church because we're just great. And, Rome is awful. The first critique that's made is of these seven churches. And, that John does not hold back in the way that he excoriates these churches. And we might think, they're being persecuted, cut them some slack. This is not easy for them. But no, he does not hold back. And so to the extent that self-critique is right at the heart of the book of Revelation, and right at the beginning, actually, it's sort of get your own house in order before you look outwards. Well, that is what Revelation does, isn't it? The church gets critiqued before the society gets critiqued. I think that's such a healthy pattern for us. And it's perhaps a little rare in cultural critique today that people turn the lens on themselves. You get the sense most of the time on Twitter that it's people telling other people why they're wrong.
Yeah.
And I think more broadly in society, there's a sense of let me explain why all the other people are wrong and why everyone should be more like me. And I think there's a real danger to that, isn't there? That through never scrutinizing ourselves, our blind spots remain blind to us. And it's just such a tonic, but also incredibly challenging and uncomfortable. The book of Revelation doesn't allow us to do that. It says, no, I'm going to shine the light on you first and turn it up really bright before we get to thinking about Rome.
Okay, excellent. Well, that's probably a good point for us to add on. Very much looking at ourselves before we critique others. Chris, it is a pleasure to speak with you again. For those who haven't read the book because they've been living in a hole or in a coma or something, the book is Biblical Critical Theory. It is doing very well. There's a lot of buzz about this book, a lot of talking about this book, and a lot of people are stimulated about it, thinking about it, and it's definitely it's definitely the book to read of this season. So, Chris, again, thanks for chatting to me. Always a pleasure to talk to you. I'll probably bump into you somewhere around Melbourne, or maybe in a on Taco Tuesday somewhere in the United States.
Absolutely, Matt. It's been such a joy speaking with you again. It's always a delight. And yeah, look, go and read Revelation. It only takes about an hour and a half. There's the deep treasure of cultural critique in there. And if you want to go further, grab Richard Bauckham's book, The Theology of the Book of Revelation, which is really brilliant.
I fully endorse that. That is a good little book, probably the best theology of Revelation ever written. But there we go. Again, Chris, great talking to you. I'll probably catch you around in the future. So take care.
Lovely. Take care, Mike.